Good day, everyone. Welcome to NextLearn's Immersive Learning University webinar series. Today's webinar is titled, Why Smart People Make Non-Smart Decisions, presented by Ken Spero. Ken is the Executive Director of NextLearn's Immersive Learning University and has been designing, developing, and delivering simulations both online and in the classroom for over 20 years. A faculty member at the University of Pennsylvania's Work-Based Learning Leadership Graduate Program, Ken is also a frequent presenter at learning conferences nationwide, to include the NextLearn's annual IOU conference. Without further ado, allow me to introduce Ken Spero.
Thank you, Lance. I hope everybody can hear me. And very much look forward to your feedback and participation in this. Please send any comments, questions in through chat, and they will be attended to either directly in chat or I will attend to them in the session. Or you can log your questions and ask them or send them in when we have a Q&A session at the end. It'll be my intention to make sure that we have time for some Q&A. So as Lance mentioned, we're going to be talking about why good people make bad decisions. You know, I've been in the space for some time now, and it continues to be amusing, I guess, almost, unfortunately frustrating at times, to look around over the course of any day and you read about something or you do something, because obviously it's often self-reflection, and you scratch your head and say, really? How many times, I'm sure, actually, if you were sitting here in front of me, I'd ask you how many times a day that happens. But whether it's reading the news, whether it's something that happens with your spouse, whether it's something that happens with your kids, or something that you do yourself, and you wonder, why would I have done that? Why did I say that? It's not that we're not smart people. It's not that the people that we're observing, whether it's on the world stage, on the work stage, whatever the case may be, it's not that they're not smart, but sometimes we do mindless things. And that is what I'm going to talk about today, which is this concept of mindlessness, and then specifically how it applies within learning, within e-learning, and see how we can learn or apply some of those concepts into improving what we do on a day-to-day basis. Okay? So from objective standpoint, what I'd like to be able to do is, in essence, really, I can let you read these for a moment, actually. So make sure that from an expectation standpoint that we're all in the same place. And really, just for starting off, it's really to distinguish this concept of experience and experience design within the confines of the Immersive Learning University, or call it immersive learning design, which is very similar. It's really to distinguish to some degree between instructional design and experience design. And not to say that good instructional design would not encompass experience design, but it really is to distinguish our objectives with our participants and within ourselves. Sometimes we're out there to teach, and sometimes we really need to be focused on providing experience, because the issues that we're attending to are contextual, and they actually require from us some amount of critical thinking in order to be successful within them. That there is not a rote way or a recipe to follow, that every time this is the way to act, this is the way to behave. It's behavioral. It's something that requires some sense of what's going on, whether it's with different people, whether it's with different situations, and therefore it really speaks to the premise that experience is required and experience is going to be our best teacher. And sometimes when we look at things through an instructional lens that require experience, it tends to complicate them. And so I want to ease some of that, but also to speak to what it is that when we talk about this idea of experience design or immersive learning design, and get into some of the aspects of how it can be utilized from the standpoint of increasing mindfulness in our participants, but actually from a starting point to actually look at how it can increase mindfulness in us from a design or from a development perspective. So why are we here? So I'm going to give you a moment to absorb this slide. It's quite a deep slide. It's very subtle. I would ask this here, you're all muted, so I can't hear if there's any chuckling going on, but hopefully this is something that, it's not a serious slide, but it is something that points to this idea of mindlessness and what happens when, to some degree, we are left to ourselves and not encouraged to be critically thinking. This is what we're trying to avoid. This is the kind of thing that should not be happening, and in any real sense shouldn't need to be called out, but in fact it is. And it happens to each of us in our daily lives and our work lives, as well as in the world, on the world stage, where we just do things by rote. And the fact of the matter is that when it comes to being mindful, it's not actually a natural act. Human beings are by nature, we are mindless, habit-forming creatures, and we actually have to work to be critical thinkers on an ongoing basis. And I wanted to actually call out one quick, to show you a quick video clip here. Hopefully you'll be able to hear the audio. Many of you might have seen this commercial before.
Humans, we mean well, but we're imperfect creatures living in a beautifully imperfect world. Sometimes the little things get us, and other times, the not so little. It's amazing we've made it this far. Maybe it's because when one of us messes up, someone else comes along to help out. At Liberty Mutual Insurance, we get that stuff out there. And our job is to make it less tough. That's the thing about humans. When things are at their worst, we're at our best. See how at libertymutual.com.
And I was noticing that it was a little choppy on through the go to webinar, so hopefully you were able to get that if you haven't seen that commercial before. But this is, I'm not here to sell insurance, but it's interesting that I found it very amusing that, given that my interest in this body of knowledge, that in fact this has become commercial. And it's true. I mean, the fact of the matter is, at the end of the day, when it comes to being critical thinkers, it's something we have to work at. Now, this is another aspect of this, is that it's funny how, to some degree, sometimes we're even wired for this. And I'm sure many of you have seen this model. This is the conscious competence model, in which we're relating, and it goes back to Noel Birch, Gordon Training International, or some people even attribute it to Abraham Maslow. And the idea here is that we start actually in this quadrant 4, where we're unconsciously competent until something changes in the environment and suddenly we're no longer good at what it is. Then we become consciously incompetent. We become aware of the fact that we're not doing it right or we're not doing it well. And then we have to work at getting new skills or changing our behaviors, and we become consciously competent until such a time as we can become unconsciously competent again. Really? So, certainly this is very, very, I don't mean to poke fun at this model. It's a very valid and important model. In fact, things like driving a car and things along those lines, we certainly want to become unconsciously competent because that's life. But on the other hand, sometimes I think we take it too far. And in fact, we do search for opportunities where we do become unconsciously competent. We choose to go about our daily lives and not necessarily spending a whole lot of time critically thinking about what we're doing. And that's the kind of thing that I want to really look at. So what is it what is mindlessness? And really, point to some of the issues that we face. What are the things that keep us from critically thinking? I'd like to point out, I point out the Ellen Langer Mindfulness on the bottom of the screen. That's a book. Ellen Langer is an author. She's a Harvard professor. Very interesting book that came out, I believe it's in the late 80s. But it's a very quick read, and it's very interesting in terms of just thinking about, what it takes to be mindful. This is different than some of the current trend on mindfulness that's more meditation-oriented. Not to say that it's not, it all falls into the same conceptual framework, but certainly that's a little bit different than for those of you who may be engaged in any current mindful activities. But some of the things, the biases, the decision-making issues that get in our way are things like habit or automatic behavior. So if I were to ask you, for those of you who are in the learning space and maybe e-learning space, and you're part of an e-learning department, let's say, and so your stakeholder comes to you and says, I need a module. Left to, without any further anything else, guidelines, what might be your first initial knee-jerk response? Well, I'm going to develop an e-learning module. Well, is that the best answer? Maybe, but maybe not. And maybe sometimes we get caught up in this habit or automatic, because that's what we do. We build e-learning, and so when we're challenged with a need, we go ahead and do what's automatic for us. We get trapped by these categories. And this is, again, there's a lot of research that has gone into each of these. You can look them up. There's a new book out called Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman, which also captures a lot of these. He's done a lot of research in the decision-making realm. We're focused on outcomes sometimes. We lose sight of, I just need to get something out to my audience and not necessarily think about the methodology or the approach I'm going to take to doing it. And again, I would not expect this of any of you folks, because obviously we're the elite. But the rest of the world out there are the ones that we tend to worry about from the standpoint of how this might come to pass. Things like loss aversion, which is very similar to the sunk cost fallacy, which is thinking about, I don't want to lose, so I'm going to go with the sure gain. Or the sunk cost aspect is the idea, well, I'm going to deploy this using the LMS because we've sunk so much money into this LMS, darn it, I'm going to use it, even if it makes no sense or it's not necessarily the greatest vehicle for us to utilize for whatever the need happens to be. So we tend to fall into some of these traps for good reasons. I mean, but if we don't critically think about why, if we don't critically think about what, and sometimes even the when, but certainly the how, that's where we fall into these traps. And again, because these traps are all around us, and in our brains, in our minds, we have to actually work to get around them. The halo effect is an interesting one, where maybe somebody, either you or somebody in your department, has done an award-winning application using a particular approach. And then we end up putting a halo around that person, that group, or that application, and think that everything about it was great. That's the way to do it. That's the way to be. That's what we want to mimic for everything moving forward, when in fact it was appropriate for that situation, but maybe not for every situation. And again, so we tend to do this. And these things apply in learning, but these things apply in almost anything we do. And in fact, for those of you who have kids, for those of you who have teenagers, these are the kinds of things that are developed during the teenage years, and our ability to actually more capably critically think. And some of these ideas might actually be, particularly relevant or particularly recognizable in light of some of the things that you may see folks doing from that perspective. So again, this is just a small list. I'll introduce a few others a little bit later on. But these are some of the kinds of things, and I want to look at it, first of all, from the standpoint of us as developers, as designers, because I think that it's very easy to focus on the needs of the mindlessness of the audience that we focus on, because that's ultimately what we're trying to repair. That's the experience we're trying to attend to. That's where the improvement in skill or behavior is going to, that's where the rubber meets the road, right? That's what we're focused on doing, and I'll get to that. But really, I think the starting point is actually in ourselves, because sometimes we get caught in these traps as well and end up doing things maybe in not as efficient or cost-effective or as effective a way from a quality standpoint that we might otherwise do. So how can we be more mindful in the tasks that we do? And it really does come down to this issue of being critical from our own perspective. So the first thing I want to do is, when we talk about this idea of experience design, the first step is to think about it a little bit more broadly maybe than you may be thinking from a starting standpoint or just from my saying the words. So when I say experience design, it may have you thinking about the experience of our participants, right? So I'm designing experiences that I want you to have. I want to, and I'll come back to this a little bit later, but I need you to add some experiences to your experience portfolio, that which you draw upon to inform your gut, to make decisions on a day-to-day basis, or in a particular skill or behavioral arena that I need you to change. That's going to be certainly a focus. But if I stop there, I may miss out on some potential opportunities relative to how it's best to proceed. Because from when we think about this idea of experience, you ought to be thinking about, well, whose experience am I capturing? I'm having you go through something, but I'd like you to go through something either the right way, or, if you're looking at giving people experience, sometimes the opportunities to give them the opportunity to fail and to fail forward. But whose experience, who's the best practitioner that I want to have you actually experience their way of doing it, or their way of thinking about it in terms of doing it? Who are the subject matter experts that I really want to capture or encapsulate what they do and how they do it, so that you can gain from that experience by doing it that way, or by thinking things through in that manner? And more importantly, even than that, is how am I thinking about deploying this? Because that's going to partly is going to affect what kinds of modalities I might be using to do it. If the expectation of me is to produce e-learning, because that's what I do and that's what my department does, well, then I may lose sight of thinking things through from a broader perspective, which is the experience that's going to be had by everyone, not just at the individual level, but the group of individuals that I'm targeting, which means I may be able to harness some benefit, not just from what each individual gets out of the application, but what I can garner from them collectively. Because in terms of creating a learning organization, in terms of affecting the culture potentially, depending on the nature of my need, if it is broader than just an individual skill, which it might be, but what if the need is a little bit bigger than that? And if I want to incorporate that into behavior, it's important that I actually make this part of the conversation on a day-to-day basis. So thinking about what happens over time more broadly across the organization, so that I may be able to affect a conversation, whether it's going on in social networking, whether it's going on through email, whether it's going on at conversations at a team meeting or a larger meeting. This is something that if I'm keeping it in mind, then I may be able to actually get a lot more out of anything that I do, and especially to create a more strategic approach that may harness from some of the power that exists elsewhere in the organization. So what are the tools of the trade? So if I am going to be thinking about that from the organizational perspective, so what can I be drawing upon? I mean, are the tools of the trade, is it really just SimWriter or some of the other tools that are out there? I mean, is that what I'm thinking about from a tools perspective? Well, I think that one of the things is to when we think about this shifting the perspective, it's to harken back to this, the well-known, this is a fairly well-known thought. I'm sure many of you have seen versions of this, where we have on the one hand the learning curve and the equally quick forgetting curve. So that's the red line if you can't see my arrow. So if we're building a module, if we're building kind of an event-based, whether or not it's a live webinar or whether it's an e-learning application, a module, whatever the case may be, but that I'm trying to deploy a specific product, as it were, that when I deploy it, if I'm just focused on the experience that I want the individual to have, I may lose sight of this concept that I may have a great module and it may be very, very well designed, but the challenge is that if I just leave it to itself, then they'll have a very high learning in the moment and then an even faster forgetting after the moment. And so obviously we want to avoid that. And so the opportunity to create a spaced learning approach in which we're spacing, maybe we take the module and we break it up. Maybe we create a series of scenarios and blend it with, and this is a version of blended learning, and certainly now when you get into mobile, so this opens up whole other conversations in terms of how you go about doing that. But when you think about the spaced approach, that maybe be built around some kind of event that's this dark line, whatever the case may be, so that you can actually reactivate the learning, because the goal here is not just, on the one hand, engagement, which is important to get them involved in the learning, but ultimately we need them to be able to retrieve it. We need them to be able to retrieve it once they actually, given that they retain it, how do we make sure they actually use it? That's where the rubber is going to really hit the road. That's where we really earn our stripes, so to speak, from a learning perspective, that we actually enable people to do things differently. So our ability to do all of this can actually be influenced by, from an organizational perspective, what is happening over time and as we space it. So when we think about those tools of the trade, It's actually a lot broader than just the physical tools that we may use to develop whatever it is we're charged with. So there may be workshops, there may be virtual, maybe e-learning, there may be some support tools, just-in-time applications that we've created or that already exist. All the better if they already exist. There may be coaching programs in place, mentoring relationships that exist, leader-driven interactions that we can blend with in terms of team meetings or other things that are going on in the organization, ongoing meetings that take place in which they're not specifically learning-oriented, but if we're tying into, if we're enabling conversation to happen, if we're enabling debriefing, if we're enabling issues to be surfaced, to be talked about, that results from people going through an experience, that is going to help, obviously, both in terms of engagement, because those who haven't gone through it may become interested in it because they've heard it from their peers or from their managers, and it may cause them even to go back and see it again because now they're seeing it through the eyes of somebody else. Who knows what can happen? When you think about the spaced learning curve, we don't know when any learning opportunity, we don't know when the learning is actually going to happen, right? We can't tell because everybody learns and processes differently. So we don't know when that light switch is going to go on. It may happen in the moment, but it may not happen for months after the moment. So the more we create an opportunity where we're present in whatever way, shape, that, or form that takes, could be reminders, it could be ongoing, whatever it is, the better chances we are going to be associated with that light switch being turned on. And the more associated we are with those light switches going on, the more engaged, the more interested they are in things that we produce. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. Clearly, something like social networking, which everybody's, many people are engaging in, whether it's business-oriented or not, constructive or not, this is an opportunity to harness that, whether you have a social networking tool internally or whether it's something that they're doing externally, the opportunity to embed these kinds of things into the conversation, the better job we can do of that, obviously the better off we are. And utilizing storytelling, utilizing the power of the narrative, using the power of experience, that's something that actually gives you the wherewithal to potentially do that. Now, it's not a slam dunk. Nothing works all the time, every time, but certainly to increase the probability from an engagement perspective. And engagement really is the key because we earn the right to do whatever we do if we can engage the audience, if we can get them interested. So by all means, using whatever tools at our disposal, and this isn't an exhaustive list. I'm sure if I asked you to interact with this in this slide, that you'd come up with other things as well. It's all good. It's all relevant. It all matters. And how we utilize these various elements to create the organizational experience is something that can actually influence what happens at the individual experience. So we go back to this idea of how do we be mindful. One of the kind of obvious things, but if you're working on your own with a challenge, it's very difficult to check yourself on being mindful. One of the issues, one of the mindless biases and heuristics is seeking confirming evidence. And I'm sure, I can certainly speak for myself, that when I am in a, let's just say a discussion or disagreement with my wife, and I have an argument that I want to make, I have a point that I want to make, I'm going to draw upon evidence that confirms my belief. Even if there's only one data point and she has 10 other data points that prove me wrong, guess which one is the most compelling to me? That one data point, that confirming evidence, that's what we look for. It's also saliency bias, which is, maybe the last thing in is the one that makes the most impression, greatest impression on us, and is most influences our ability to confirm our way of thinking. So if I try to have my conversation with me, myself, and I, oftentimes myself and I often agree with me. So you want to find opportunities where you can actually have discourse. Bouncing ideas off of the second person is often helpful. But short of that, here's a tool that you might find useful as a critical thinking vehicle to be thinking about any learning need that you have relative to how you're going to deploy it. A set of characteristics that you may think about from the audience perspective, and then the next screen is going to look at it from the learning objective perspective, just to see whether or not, okay, as I'm thinking about this, my first reaction was to think about this from an e-learning perspective, or whatever, maybe this, I think, classroom, so I'm going to do it from that perspective. Here's just on a scale, on a sliding scale, thinking about the characteristics of the audience from this set of characteristics. Are they widely dispersed, or are they highly concentrated? So if they're widely dispersed, I may not think of, if I was thinking about the classroom, because this is something that I've got a great instructor for, or I've got a great room for it, or this is something that I really thought, I'd like to get people together, but if this audience is widely dispersed, that may make that difficult. And so just, giving yourself that check may help you from that perspective. And doing any of these may help to critically think about what it is that I'm doing and make a smarter decision, and not just do things by rote. And again, if you're looking for confirming evidence, there's always going to be that wherewithal to do so. But here we're kind of maybe loading the deck a little bit against ourselves to make sure that, well, especially if we're challenged, that we've at least thought it through. And even if we are not necessarily being as mindful as we could be, but we're better prepared with, it's going to be a more mindful version of mindlessness, as it were. So thinking about things from this perspective help us to begin to think about the way that this is going to be deployed. And maybe what tools, maybe this is something that, one of the things that came up in one of the sessions that I've run in the past was a conversation with a student who shared with us an example where she was doing some work for leadership development need in a financial services company, and actually a fairly high-level audience. And they had very little budget, and they needed to develop an interaction, a set of interactions that they thought that doing it scenario-based was going to be important, and they developed it using SurveyMonkey, which isn't going to be your greatest tool in terms of, you wouldn't think of it as your greatest tool, but what it comes down to is design. And if you think through from a perspective of what it is you need to accomplish and how you design it, almost any tool will do, or a combination of them. And so again, so broadening one's perspective on how to do things and how to manage the experience that the students are going to have, both individually but both also as a group, or also more broadly than the team, is something that can enable you to think these things through from a richer perspective. And now this is the characteristics from the standpoint, and we, by the way, will make these slides available through the ILU, so bear that in mind as you're going through this. So we will share this with you so you can have at least, have this available to you from the standpoint of capturing the information. But here's another set of characteristics, but this is now from the learning objective perspective. So if you have a set of learning objectives that you have in front of you that you're looking to design against, think them through from the standpoint of what it is you're trying to accomplish and what modality, what type of interaction would be best to address this need. Is this something that can be processed through instruction? Is this something that would benefit from experience? Is this something that needs both? So experience is going to be your best teacher, but if they don't have any knowledge about the content, then having experience with it will be setting them up for failure, but not necessarily in a positive way. So thinking about, how you want them to, or how they will process things from the characteristics of the needs is something that can, again, create a more mindful approach and address some of our tendencies towards being mindless, and thinking about things from the standpoint of, mandatory versus discretionary content. So if they have to go through it, that may ease some of the burden of my over-designing it because they have to do it. So, I may be oriented, and I'm going to come back to an example of this. I may be inclined to really, go all out because I'm excited about the content, but if they have to do it anyway, is that going to be a good use of my time? Well, maybe it will be, but maybe thinking through then why I want to do it that way and what I benefit from that, again, is something that is going to be important. Is it discrete ideas versus a synthesis of ideas? If it's discrete, I can deploy them, I can lay them out in a recipe. I can lay out the information in a modular format. If it's synthesis, then I need to be able to demonstrate to them, or I need to enable them to have experience with how these concepts blend, how they interrelate, how they interact. So they may know the concepts, but not have a sense of how they can be deployed. I got a kick out of, thinking back, those of you who were around doing this set of activities back in the 90s, when diversity was the biggest show in town relative to some of the needs that organizations had. And this is when diversity was primarily, at least in this country, more the EEO responsibilities, so the issues of race and gender, religion, and how that played out in the workplace. And obviously this was a high need area, but it got done in a vacuum. You look at diversity training, and you got training on diversity as if you had moments in which this is just a diversity moment. Nothing else is going on in the organization, so I'm going to train you just in diversity, and nothing else is going on. And that was silly, because the fact of the matter is that if I'm trying to create a context, diversity doesn't happen in a vacuum. Diversity happens in the context of leadership, in the context of being on a team, of dealing with customers, whatever the case may be, and wherever the issue of diversity plays out. And certainly now when we talk about global diversity and personalities and ways of thinking and diversity of thought, which is certainly more broad, but these things don't tend not to happen in a vacuum. And so the opportunity to create the context and the way these things play out is often as important, if not more important, than putting the ideas out themselves. But certainly thinking about things in the blend, thinking about the opportunities for, that's where the mindfulness comes into play. Because I need you to see through the lens of the complex world that we live in and apply your knowledge, apply your thinking, almost, if we want to be mindless, at least mindlessly be a critical thinker. We want you mindlessly thinking about things, if that makes any sense, in terms of how you approach these elements. And I'm sorry if I'm a bit on a soapbox here, but I tend to get passionate about these things. But again, if you have questions, by the way, please, and I will give you my email after the fact, so please, by all means, send them in. I'm happy to talk to you more about this and to continue some of the development and sharing. And part of the idea within the ILU, by the way, if I can plug that further, is this idea of creating the community. And so, this particular format doesn't lend itself to a whole lot of interaction in the context of the webinar itself, but certainly to encourage the ongoing, the after the fact interaction. Please, that's something we'd like to encourage. So if you have questions, please jot them down, either submit them in chat or send them an email, and we'll hopefully get them posted so that we can share the insights, because the learning that happens, and one of the things that is clear relative to this kind of approach, is the opportunity anytime that you can put people with others, then you just increase the power of what you're doing exponentially. So even though the benefit of e-learning and the benefit of the things that we're doing are targeted at the individual, by thinking about the broader appeal and the interaction, opportunities for interaction amongst others, is something that's going to be very powerful. So when we shift now quick to the individual experience, and how do we encourage our participants to be more mindful? So that's now going to be this issue of putting things into a context, putting things into something that is recognizable. What we want to create is an opportunity where, when we're being mindless, what happens is we face a problem, and when we're facing that problem, we're going to have some kind of reaction, right? We're going to have some kind of gut reaction. So somehow the experience portfolio is this idea that, it was what I call it, but the idea that somewhere in our brains we're very quickly sifting through this portfolio of experiences that we have, and our subconscious is gleaning whatever it can of value from that portfolio of experiences and informing our gut. And then we take action, and then we deal with results, and obviously the problems often come back. So what we're trying to encourage is actually a process by which maybe we actually take a moment, a fraction of a moment, to consider our options, to think a little bit more strategically maybe about what are the consequences of doing that. And before I actually take an action, maybe I can think through a set of potential options and what those consequences are before I actually take action. Now, clearly, this is a lot to be thinking about, and it's not going to happen in this deliberate a way, but this is kind of what's going to be going on in the critical thinking aspect, which is just to take that pause, that second look, before we act on that initial gut reaction, to actually pause first and say, did I think about that, or am I just reacting? And the more that we can enable this to happen, the more that we can create this muscle memory where people, in fact, where our students, where our participants are actually, we liberally use the virtual 2x4 and the experiences that we provide them, whack them between the eyes and say, that was a mindless response. Did you think about the reaction to this other stakeholder? Did you think about the potential consequence from this behavioral aspect? Did you think about it through this lens, even though I know this seems obvious to you, but do we take the opportunity to enable them to trip in the safe environment? So the tripping is obviously only conceptual. The issue of the ego, the issue of the shame that they might otherwise feel of getting it wrong is minimized, is muted, because it's only between them and where they're experiencing it. The opportunity to encourage this kind of critical thinking is significant. And so here's some of the other, from the research perspective, other things that are going on relating to framing. How things are framed can very often influence how they're received. We can put things in a very positive light, and they lose sight of the negative aspect. They can't relate to things in the negative, or we relate it in the negative, but they can't relate it back to the positive. Where we anchor them, they're anchored in a particular way of doing things and don't sufficiently adjust to, and this is often happening in advertising, where advertisers anchor us to a particular brand's particular way of doing things or thinking about things, and we get locked in. And even though we do adjust, we don't adjust sufficiently if we don't critically think about it. Again, the seeking confirming evidence, groupthink, because, well, that's the way everybody does it, right? And we tend to fall into that opportunity. And acting from a single perspective, again, so the issues are, these are the traps that are around us at all times and that our brains are looking for, because that's the way we're wired. And again, this isn't a criticism by any stretch of the imagination. This is something we are all subject to as human beings, and this is something that we have to work against. This is something that we have to be vigilant about, both in ourselves, but also in our participants and in our teams. And one of the things that is quite unfortunate, and this is prevalent in sports, you hear about this. I'm originally from Cleveland, and so sadly I'm a Cleveland sports fan, and learned helplessness is, for those of you who follow sports, you know what you probably know what I'm referring to, whether you follow baseball, basketball, or football. They talk about the idea of forgetting how to win. And in many organizations that have been depressed because of the current economic environment, we get into a funk, and it becomes very difficult to see, to see the light at the end of the tunnel. We've experienced layoffs. We're still standing, but a lot of our friends got let go, or whatever the case may be, and we fall into this negative perspective. Again, it comes back to the framing issue, and this is something that we can actually utilize these experiences to help people get out of, to help them experience, the danger of falling into the helplessness aspect, but also being able to see what winning is all about, and to remind them of what that is, so that we can rekindle that kind of spirit. Because if we're positive, if we have a more positive frame, obviously greater things are possible. So I want to go back real quickly to talk about this idea of how simulations can be utilized in this perspective, and then we'll play through a couple of examples and look at some of the various elements that help to encourage, within the confines of experience design, how we look to address being more mindful, and hopefully leave some time at the end for questions that maybe have been coming up. So, fundamentally, it does start with engagement, and I'll speak. The next slide will be go into this a little bit more. But one of the things in the research on the brain is that one of the things that helps us to get engaged is some kind of emotional engagement. And one of the things that experience stories are going to help us do is to be emotionally engaged. And if we can do that, then addressing that first hump, which is getting them interested, because there's lots of distraction out there, whether it's real distraction of work, and I'm really busy, and I've got deliverables, and I've got deadlines, I've got milestones, or whether it's just so much else going on in my day-to-day. I've got this family issue, I've got this friend who's pinging me, I've got this things that are coming up in Facebook, I've got who knows what, I got this person, these people contacting me. Whatever the case may be, certainly the news has been an incredible distraction of late. So if I want to make sure, if I'm competing against that, I need to find ways to get people engaged. Emotional engagement is going to be key, and experience is going to be a stronger starting point from by which to do that. So again, we want to talk about this idea of the experience design gives us the opportunity to populate the portfolio, the experience portfolio. You know, if you're dealing with issues like first-time skills, say yesterday I've got a group of people that were individual contributors. They've been promoted, and now I've got to make them better supervisors. When it comes to leadership skills, their experience portfolios are essentially empty, right? What made them great individual contributors and worthy of promotion may actually make them bad managers. So how do I enable them to orient around how to be in this new environment, so I can give them experiences to do that, so that what they did mindlessly before, they now reorient and start to be more mindful about, how do I do this from a leadership perspective, and to consequate, positively mindfulness, but also consequate negatively mindlessness. So I can have them fall into the traps, and then whack them with that virtual 2x4 to have them think about what they did and why that was mindless and why it's bad in this new environment, or whatever the case may be. We want to find opportunities for people to fail forward. So the opportunity to put their foot in it, to step sideways, to do things wrong, or to try it out just to see what may happen, and in that way experience and learn from that opportunity. We also want to accelerate time, because sometimes what helps us to stay mindless is our inability to directly connect the consequence with the action, because the consequence doesn't happen until later. And often there's a delayed effect. And we want to be able to capture that delayed effect, but also deliver it in a timely fashion so they can actually make that connection directly and see the consequences of their specific effect. And fundamentally, to leverage the power of storytelling. There is no single element that I know from a tool perspective that is more engaging to more people, more places in the world. I mean, fundamentally, it's interesting. You just don't have to look any further than, say, Harry Potter to look at the power of storytelling. Even in this day and age where we look at generational differences and different learning styles and global requirements, cultural requirements, there is no single culture in the world that doesn't appreciate a good story. There is no age that doesn't appreciate a good story. And even to the point of the issue of attention deficit that we seem to think our current generation suffers from, the fact of the matter is that when they were engaged by something like Harry, and not to say that everything we produce has to be Harry Potter-esque, but all ages were reading the books. These were not short books. There were 7 of them, and they, in my experience, certainly with my kids and in my experience, they didn't read in 10 to 15-minute increments. When they were engaged, they read. And they read for long periods of time, and they came back to read for other long periods of time. So that just demonstrates, and I'm sure you all are familiar with this because there's lots of data out there on this, is the power of engagement from the standpoint of the story. So real quickly, and I do want to get on to the example, this is from just some summary information from the book by John Medina called Brain Rules, which I highly recommend for those of you if you haven't read it. This looks at how we're wired, how the brain is wired, and how do we move things from short-term to long-term memory, that challenge, that forgetting curve, it's the various ways of why that happens. But this is some of the things that we can draw upon that enable us to keep things present, to keep them in the brain, and to move them from where we hold them in short-term, but actually to move them on to the long-term aspect so they can be retained and they can be retrieved when they're necessary from the standpoint of being able to draw upon them in a more mindful manner. Okay, so I want to show you a quick scenario. The story behind this is a compliance. So I mentioned this idea of mandatory versus discretionary. This is compliance. So for a pharmaceutical company, the premise here was that the challenge for the organization was they had infringements in the field, and they were mandated by the government to deliver compliance training. They had to go through 2 hours of compliance training a year. The client decided that, in fact, compliance is a behavioral issue. It's not a knowledge issue. They've read the manual, so that's not the issue. The issue is that many of the things that are unethical, that are unlawful, are actually intuitive. They're not intuitively wrong. They're intuitively the action that you feel that you want to do, the behavior feels right. It doesn't seem wrong because it's not logical necessarily. It's not intuitive that it would be wrong. And so how do we address those behaviors? If you're wired to actually react in one way, how do you get people to actually think twice before they do it? So here's that's the background, and the scenario here is.
Meeting isn't scheduled until 2:30.
I'll let you listen.
I tried to drop in on your mother-in-law to see how she is. She lost her job a while ago and has been fairly depressed since then. When you arrive at Justine's house, she seems very down. Listen to what she has to say.
I just had a doctor's appointment, and he told me that my blood pressure is too high. He thinks it's because I'm stressed out about losing my job. I used to take Ludacol, but I stopped when I ran out of refills. Besides, my blood pressure was under control. Anyway, my doctor has given me a new prescription for Ludacol, but I just can't afford it right now. I know that your company sells Ludacol. I wouldn't normally ask, but is there any chance that you could give me some of your samples? I'm finding it difficult to make ends meet at the moment, and I promise that I won't tell anyone that you gave them to me.
Your mother-in-law has asked you for samples. How should you handle this situation?
Okay, so real simply, we've got a scenario here, and Lance, if you can get the poll ready, it's either A, give her the samples, or B, explain you're only permitted to give samples to licensed healthcare practitioners. So what are you going to do? So you can either do her the favor or explain to her and not give them to her. What are you going to do? So go ahead and answer the questions, please. Okay, so if we close the poll now, I'll give you another, okay, if we sharing poll results. Okay, everybody says B. Okay. Well, quickly, let's make that choice.
Justine is disappointed that you won't bend the rules for her, but understands she doesn't want to put you into a bad situation.
Okay, so just a couple things to point out before I proceed. That's the actually, if we have time for one more. So let me do, before I come back to the feedback on that, let me show you one more example. This was a different application. And in the interest of time, I will just tell you what's going on here. This is a doctor, again, from this is in compliance. This is a doctor you've been trying to interact with for a long time. You're building a very deep relationship with him. And he's telling you about a golf outing that he's got coming up with some very key people in a foursome that they have. And they have an opening in the foursome. And he's inviting you to come and play golf with them from the standpoint of an opportunity for your building relationships with these other very important potential stakeholders in your management of your territory. So, but he's offering you, would you mind actually paying for the golf fees, for the greens fees, for the 18 holes? That's not a lot of, it's not a ton of money, and it would give you access to these very important people. What are you going to do? Do you tell them you'd love to join the group and you'll pay for the greens fees? Give them a tentative yes, but you have to verify what's going on to see if this is within your guidelines. Do you counter with a separate outing on your terms? Do you explain that you can pay for him but not for the entire group? Or do you just tell them no? And as you can see when I put my cursor over the things, it gives you a little bit more of an elaboration to the side. It's a little slow coming up. But real quickly, so Lance, if you put the next poll up, these are the 5 options. Tell them you'd love to join the group and pay for the green fee, so just say yes. Give them a tentative yes is B. Counter with a separate outing on your terms, that's C. Explain that you can pay for him, but not the entire group, so you can pay for one person, but not all 4. Or just tell him no. What would you want to do? All right, we're going to have to close this quickly, so give me another 10 seconds. Okay, go ahead, Lance. Okay, so you went with just tell him no. Okay. So the consequence, as you explained, Dr. Squire, is against Medicaid policy. He nods and accepts your explanation. Okay. So coming back to the earlier discussion. So one of the things to bear in mind, obviously I'm not interested necessarily in teaching you all compliance, or if you're not from the pharmaceutical industry, this may not have been compelling. But I want to call out a few things from this standpoint of how this can be used, obviously from the standpoint of being able to encourage mindfulness. One, from the emotional engagement perspective, certainly this scenario, we're using the picture, so it's not even using media. I did use audio, but I could have just, there's a transcript on the bottom, could just as easily have done this using text. Using the picture of the mother-in-law, using just the concept of the mother-in-law without a picture, in many people would evoke an emotional response, because we all either have one or we know somebody who does have one, and there are lots of stories and television shows or whatever we read that evoke some kind of reaction to mother-in-law anyway. Then we put in the picture, again, the emotional reaction to draw you in, to suck you in to a potentially behavioral response or an intuitive response that's counter to the ethics. Because, in fact, in this kind of scenario, and many of you answered the question correctly, even though she is your mother-in-law and she does have a need, you're not allowed to give samples to anybody. You can only get samples, you can only get medications from a licensed physician, a prescription from a licensed physician, and therefore you're only allowed to give samples to a licensed physician. So this is a scenario, and again, we're trying to have them, if you didn't know the answer to that, even though it is your mother-in-law, we're trying to pull on those heartstrings. Now, at the end, so in terms of further enabling this mindful perspective, now at the end of the scenario, at the end of the set of scenarios, we give feedback in terms of what was going on, and here we point to the issues of what was going on relative to the decisions that were made. So we want to further provoke thought or critical thinking, or add it to that experience portfolio. Some of those elements have been able to connect the dots of what was going on in the scenario in terms of the narrative, and then also from the perspective of linking this to other behaviors. Because it's important that they realize that it's not like diversity, it's not a diversity moment, it's not a compliance moment. It's happening in the context of my day-to-day. So what this client decided they wanted to link this compliance behavior with their leader behaviors, because good compliance actions is actually part of being a good leader. And so they would actually get feedback across, again, when they play, each simulation was an hour, they would have got a broader set of feedback relating to how it linked also, in addition to the CIA, which is the Compliance Integrity Agreement objectives, also how it tied in with leader behavior. So from the standpoint of assembling these, and this is just one approach, of trying to attend to how do we enable people to be more mindful from the perspective of their activities and behaviors. Here's a bunch of other examples which I will not be able to get to at this time. And again, what I just mentioned is to remember that from the experience design perspective, there's a variety of ways in which we can bring the lessons out, which is the story, the flow, the options that I give you to choose from, the consequences that I enable you to experience, the feedback that I give you, whether it's narrative or scorecard, and then the discussion. So the points can come out, the opportunities for critical thinking and mindfulness happen at any stage of the game. And so when we think about mindfully assembling the experience we want the organization to have, the individuals to have within the organization, these are all the levers that I can pull to make sure that that's going to happen. And so as you begin to piece through, as you think about the audience characteristics, as you think about the learning objective characteristics, you think about the tools of the trade, of what it is we want to assemble, what experience do I need people to have, these are the kinds of things that we can draw upon from the standpoint of enabling positive experience, mindful experiences, and to reduce the potential effects and reduce the tendencies towards mindless behavior on an ongoing basis, both in ourselves, in terms of how we respond to design challenges, but also in our participants. So I will leave it at that. I will call out again the Immersive Learning University Conference. Our third annual conference is going to be coming up in January, hopefully in Charleston. It looks like at this point I may be doing, if you're interested in these ideas and the exploration of experience design in more depth, doing a workshop, and these will be some of the elements that will be called out in additional webinars that I'll be doing over the course of the year. I won't be doing the next one, but there will be others scheduled, so stay tuned for announcements from Next Learner from the ILU with respect to upcoming events. And if you have questions, by all means, send them in. And in terms of being able to be in touch, I encourage you to go to the ILU site. If you want to contact me directly, by all means do so, or send information in to if you have contacts already at NextLearn, by all means, or send in your questions as appropriate. But very happy to talk to any of you about this further, and I wish